what I've been working on for the last 2 weeks or so was the idea of building something kind of like a visual of what the pins kind of look like physically on the Raspberry Pi, and you can manipulate them within the application and set them to input or output and read or write to the pins. And I kind of wanted to make it skeuomorphic, to borrow a term from mobile device development, so that you can like kind of see the pin on the screen and see the pin in real life and make a relationship mapping between the two so that you understand what's going on. It's really to help people who are new to Raspberry Pi or any of these smaller computers to be able to understand what it is that they're physically manipulating when they're doing breadboarding or whatever, so that you can make a connection to the real world with what you're doing. It's really like a basic first-timer kind of tool. And so let me kind of show you what I've got. I'm just going to boot it up to start with. So let me switch to the camera. All right. So this is just an Adafruit T cobbler. It's just a breakout board for the Raspberry Pi. You can see this is just a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's a W, but I'm not going to use the wireless on it right now. And all I'm going to do is use the OTG port for the other work that I've been doing so that it gets an Ethernet connection over that USB. So I just plugged it in. There's nothing really special that happens. It does boot up. It assigns itself a static IP, and then it also starts up a DHCP server and gives my MacBook a dynamic IP. So I can open that up really quick just so you get a chance to see what that looks like. All right, so it shows up as this CDC composite gadget, and you can see that it assigned me an IP address of 192.168.73.34. The Raspberry Pi itself is actually on 192.168.73.1. And when it boots up, it actually boots up a Phoenix server as well. So I can go and visit that IP address. And what I see is actually just this pin mapping of basically what the Raspberry Pi headers look like. And so what you can kind of see here is that we've got this Pi cobbler thing on a breadboard, and we've got this web page that looks kind of like it. And the idea that I had was, well, what if I make it so that I can tap on a GPIO pin, set it as an input or an output. In this case, I have a button wired up to this pin, so I'm going to set it as an input. And then when I toggle the hardware, when I press the button, have the web page actually update with what's going on. So you can see I'm pressing it in, it turns green, I let go, and it turns red. And so the button, the physical button, is manipulating the screen on the web page. And this is all running on Phoenix on the Raspberry Pi Zero. The other thing that I wanted to do was be able to toggle or manipulate the output. And so you can see I pick a pin and I set it as output. And now I can actually toggle the LED. You can kind of see it turning on and off there as I click on this to change the state of the output. And you can really do this with any of the GPIO pins. I have another LED on the other side, so I'll show you that LED turning on and turning off. So this is kind of really exciting just because it gives us an ability to have a firmware that you can just load on a Raspberry Pi Zero and start using right away without really having to understand like the entire Nerves ecosystem to start with. You can just flash a firmware on there, play around with it on a breadboard, and see how manipulating the breadboard and the wires and everything works. You can use it as a proof of concept really to understand what you're doing and make sure that your breadboarding is good. So that was kind of the excitement of the last 2 weeks. The technical background of this is that it is so it's a Nerves firmware that runs a DHCP server, has a static IP, gives out a dynamic IP to the host, to the MacBook that it's plugged into, and as a result of that, I can actually load up a Phoenix server that listens there, go visit the Phoenix server, and I have the physical mapping and the digital mapping on the screen right next to each other. Beyond that, the Phoenix server actually just boots up a React application, and on the client side of the React component, it establishes a WebSocket connection, and each pin gets its own channel. And so as I'm pressing this button, it's sending a message over the Phoenix channel, which goes to a gen server and manipulates the GPIO pin the way that it's supposed to. All of the different functions work that way. So mapping a pin as an input or an output, that's a Phoenix channel connection. That's a message passed that way. Whenever an interrupt is hit for the rising or falling of an input, so when I press this button, the interrupt hits the gen server, and the gen server turns around and broadcasts to the Phoenix channel. So it's almost immediate. When you press that button, you see the screen update. Another kind of interesting thing that you can do as a result of this, because it's using these Phoenix channels, I'll just show you this kind of one more neat thing here. You can actually have multiple applications running on the same thing. So you can see side by side we've got the same exact thing going on. I press the button and both of them turn green. And I can manipulate either GPIO pin, and you see everything just kind of updating in sync. I mean, it wasn't a goal to be able to have multiple browser windows open and manipulate it at the same time, but it kind of, you get that for free just by the fact that you have a gen server backing all this data and Phoenix channels and everything. So it's really cool that all this stuff just kind of worked out the way that it did. But that's really it in a nutshell. There's not a whole lot here that's like of particular interest for somebody who's already advanced at nerves. But if you're just getting started, it feels like this is a pretty good starter for all of that. So I wanted to share that. If anybody's watching, do you have any questions about this stuff? I'd love to be able to help if anybody has questions. You can just put something in the chat room. This has been a little bit of an adventure for me, just because working on nerve systems is fun. It's a little bit challenging. I've not done much like it before. I mean, I did some kernel compilation during college, but it was never anything really deep. So doing build root stuff and running through the menu configs and all that, it appeals to the geek side of me, but I'm not particularly good at it right now. I am happy that I was able to work on that RPi0 system and get people an image that they can work with out of the box that gives you like that gadget mode over the USB. That's pretty cool. And I'm happy that I'm able to do that. So I guess maybe one other thing that I can do, I see you there, Brian. Thanks for joining. One other thing that I can do is, if I can get my font to scale, because it's probably not easy to see that, I can just kind of walk through the basic architecture of this thing. It's not well architected. This was totally prototype mode, and so you might see some of the messiness of the edges here, but everything right now is in the Phoenix app. In fact, the firmware is really just loading the Phoenix app and starting it up. There's nothing at all going on other than that. But I can kind of jump into the web. Where's a good place to start here? I can go into the template of the Phoenix app and just kind of show you the page. In fact, all I did was put a root container there so that the React application can start up, and then everything inside the React application is in the static JS. And so I'm using Webpack and React. That was actually brand new for me, so I'm not really all that familiar with any of this stuff. The React app itself just hooks into that DOM element, but the real interesting stuff is in the board and the pin. I was able to use components in React to model the physical board and the pins that are on it, so that kind of felt pretty good. So the board, when it starts up, all it does is join the board channel, which is the whole board. There's nothing special on this one except there's a single call to get the pins. And then, let me see if I can increase the font again here. I'm realizing it's pretty hard to read. Okay, that should be better. So as it joins this socket channel, it gets a state back as part of joining, and that just tells it what pins this particular board has. And you can kind of see that in the board model. This is a lot like an ecto model in some ways. It's just a struct, and so there's like basically a static board defined with the Raspberry Pi pins on it, and what characteristics those pins have, so what you can do with them. So obviously we don't want to be able to map the 5-volt pin to input and output because that doesn't really make any sense. So this just basically gives the client some clues on whether or not it should enable or disable those pins for input and output. And then kind of going back to the component side of things, the pin is actually really the interesting part here. So the React component for the pin is where it looks for pin status changes, and then joins the channel. And so whenever there's a pin status change, all it does is update the React component's state and causes it to re-render. And there's all kinds of stuff in here, and it's kind of ugly, and sorry about that. It's been a while since I JavaScripted this hard. But it's really just interacting with those bootstrap buttons to figure out what the current state is and whether or not they're in a place where they should be able to be mapped, or if they're in a currently active state where they're looking for input or output. This is something that I'll probably clean up pretty soon here. I also have a designer working with me. I work at Gaslight, and we have teams of designers and developers, and luckily I have some really fantastic designers that work with me. And so he's interested in tiny computers like I am. He just moved out to LA, but I'm really excited about the fact that he's willing to work on this. So he's going to make that UI look a little bit nicer. That was just me bootstrapping what you saw before. So that's really it. I mean, the pin talks to the server, and then once you get to the server side and you start joining these channels, there's a board channel, and all it's doing is looking for levels to change. Like if you want to set the output to high or low, you can set the direction of the pin to input or output. You can release the channel. I didn't show that. You can actually release a pin. So if I'm done with GPIO 2 here, and I want to use it as an output instead of an input, I can just click and hold, and it will release that. And so then I can remap it later if I want to. I'd have to change the breadboard to do that, but I don't really feel like doing that at the moment. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot to this application. It's basically opening as big a pipe to the hardware as possible and just letting you map all the pins. That was kind of my goal here, was to make it easy for somebody to get started with. I think that's really all I got. I'm going to go ahead and stop. I might post this to YouTube if it seems like it was worthwhile. Let me switch back over to this camera here. So that's it. Thanks for joining, Brian. I appreciate it. Oh, hey, I see your message there. Yeah, Phoenix channels and React, they are both new to me. I spent a lot of time scratching my head and reading the Programming Phoenix book and scouring the web for how to figure out how to do React. I actually tried using something called Materialize CSS, and I had all kinds of problems building it. I ended up switching back to Bootstrap for the UI, but I liked the way that Materialize CSS looked better. It's just when it got down to functioning in the JavaScript, everything is hard in that ecosystem. I mean, every time I npm install something, I just want to like rage quit JavaScript. So I'm happy that I was able to get Webpack and React happy, and I'm glad that Bootstrap worked. That was actually the hardest part. Everything else was, the mental model was already there. It was the React side that I didn't have a mental model yet. So yeah, so picking one new thing per project, that would have been a good idea for me. I thought I was, and then I found out all the different technologies that I was learning, and it felt a little overwhelming. The only thing that kept me going was the promise that Greg Mefford was going to bring donuts if my prototype worked today, and so it did. He would have brought donuts anyway, but it was my trick on my own mind to make me keep working on it. Any other questions from anyone? I'm happy to be able to do this. This is kind of fun for me, especially when the kids go to bed. I'm assuming they're still in bed. I'm down in the basement. Yeah, the dev tools are pretty neat. I didn't realize that WebSocket stuff was in there. It makes sense. It's really helpful, but it's kind of a little bit hidden if you're not used to seeing it. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining, everyone. I appreciate it. I hope to do this more often. I hope to have other people also kind of have a similar stream of like their work so that everybody can see what's going on in the nerves world. It's really exciting to see this. A lot of companies and people aren't able to share the kind of work that they do. This is all a hobby for me, so I get to share basically everything that I do. And I get a lot of support from people at work, and I get to work around Greg Mefford every once in a while, and he works on it full time, so that's fun. Yeah, exactly. I will learn random JavaScript technologies for donuts. That's more true than I was willing to admit before today. But Greg bringing in those donuts felt pretty good, so I think I might try that again in the future. I've worked on Ember and I've worked on Angular before, so React was new. Ember has a huge learning curve. Angular had a little bit more. React is actually really natural, but I have a feeling it's just because I learned Ember and Angular before it. and I still would want to burn down any JavaScript framework I have to use unless it makes sense in the project I'm working on. We used to have a joke at work that the rule zero of our company was that you don't overlook a JavaScript framework when you're building an app from the ground up, because you're going to have JavaScript at some point, so you might as well build it in at the beginning. Now the new rule one is don't use JavaScript until you absolutely have to, because the ecosystem just feels broken. So we've come full circle on it. We just Rails new or Phoenix new and hope for the best as long as we can. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and sign off here.